Today's date is 29 November 2023. I am in Virginia and I'm conducting an interview with Diane Evans. Thank you very much, Diane, for sitting down and agreeing to talking to us.
You're welcome. Thank you for the
Yep.
opportunity, Dennis.
You're very welcome. Tell us where you are right now.
I live in Helena, Montana.
Okay.
And
So if you would just give us a little bit of background on who you are. Where were you born? Where did you grow up and go to school? That kind of thing.
yeah, that's 77 years ago. I had a birthday. I was born in Buffalo, Minnesota, to parents who owned a dairy farm. My father was a dairy farmer and my mother was a registered nurse. They had six of us, four boys and two girls, and while dad was out in the fields and milking cows and doing farm labor, mom was raising us and going to the hospital as head nurse on her unit for 45 years while she raised six kids and had a garden and a farm.
Wow.
So yeah, I grew up on that farm knowing very hard work. I knew how to work hard and I knew how to not quit. When you're on a dairy farm, you can't quit. You have to do your
Right,
chores and get them.
right. Wow.
I learned that early.
Wow. Where did you go to school?
Well, across the fields from us was the Carlson. I'm a Carlson. My family name is Carlson.
Right.
They homesteaded in 1863, and they built a little country school called the Carlson School. And that's where I and all my ancestors went since 1863. Country school, 8 years. And for high school, I had to get on a bus and go into the big town of Buffalo, Minnesota, which was 2,500 people. So
Wow.
big transition for a country girl to
Yeah.
go to town school.
Yeah. Did you have any relatives that were members of the military?
I did. Yeah. My mother's sister, they grew up in North Dakota, was World War II, and she joined the military and in the Women's Army Corps
Right.
and as an enlisted woman. And when she graduated, she used that GI Bill and she went to Columbia University and got her PhD, her doctorate degree, and taught college in New Jersey. And she was quite the role model for me, as my mother was my North Star. My mother was a huge role model, influenced my entire life. I think she still does. I think of her so often. But yeah, Aunt Ruth, she was determined to get an education and never would have been able to do it without that GI Bill. My uncle, Ernie, went into the Army, World War II. He was drafted. I had an uncle who was a bomber pilot and survived. So, and then my two older brothers. My oldest brother joined in the 60s and was in the 101st Airborne. And then my second oldest brother, Ronald, was drafted in 65. And all my parents could think about was he was going to Vietnam. He got orders for Korea, and he was on the DMZ. But never in their wildest dreams did they think of their daughter joining the Army and her going to Vietnam. That was quite a shock
Right.
for them, I'm
Why did
afraid.
Why did you decide to enlist in the Army?
Well, there's several reasons, Dennis. In 1964, I graduated from high school. My mother had been my biggest influence. She loved nursing. I was certain I wanted to be a nurse. And in the mid 60s, I'm in Minneapolis in nursing school, and we were not allowed to have televisions in our rooms, in our dorm. So there was one TV in the nurses' lounge, and I would go down there and watch the 6 o'clock news. And I would see what was happening in Vietnam.
Right.
And I decided I wanted to go there. And so in 1966, I found a Army Nurse Corps recruiter downtown Minneapolis. I walked 10 blocks so I wouldn't have to pay money for a bus. I walked downtown Minneapolis, found the recruiting office, went in and asked her how I could go to Vietnam. And the other part of that answer to your question is why. As a nurse, I saw that there was a need in Vietnam, but my farm buddies My 4-H buddy, for example, all men, all boys,
Right.
they were all getting draft notices. And why? Why were they getting draft notices? Well, because they were not in college. They didn't get a college deferment. So it became evident to me that there was some like, is this fair? Like, you go to college so you don't have to go off to war. What's that about?
Right.
What about these hardworking farm boys who want to take over the family farm? Like my two brothers, all my brothers, and all but three, or all but one of my brothers ended up farming. And none of them went to college, but they were all very successful. And my brother Ronald, who was older, just 1 year older than me, he had 3 friends who were killed in Vietnam, farm buddies, farm boys. And so I thought, well, if my brothers have to go and all these farm boys have to go, I should too. And then my 4-H buddy, Dennis Bodine, from a local nearby farm near my dad's farm, was killed in Vietnam. And we all knew the family, and it was really devastating. And it happened just, I don't know, about the time I was going to Vietnam. So my parents were very, very worried that I'm going to go off to war, and am I not going to come home? Like, women don't come home from war either. Sometimes they also, and I knew that. I'd read a lot of, excuse me. I was very intrigued, as you can imagine, by war stories from other wars, but there weren't a lot of books written by women veterans. But there were books not written by them, but there were stories about them, and I was pretty aware of the women who died in World War II, for example. And a lot of women died in World War I, nurses, all nurses. And the majority of them, Dennis, died by the flu, that flu that was killing millions worldwide. So they were sacrificing their lives as well.
Right. What year did you join the military?
So I graduated from nursing school in 1967, but that, as I just mentioned, when I went downtown Minneapolis to see a recruiter, it was 1966, and I was a junior.
Okay.
In nursing. And I didn't know until the recruiter said, well, you're just in time. The government has a program. There's a shortage of nurses, and there's a program that Uncle Sam will pay for your tuition, your books, your uniform, and give you a stipend if you sign here on the dotted line and promise to give the Army 2 years back. So that was good news, and I didn't realize that that was part of this opportunity. But so my senior year was paid for, and then when I passed, nurses have to take a test.
Right.
We called it state boards back then. It's called something different now. But I passed my state boards in 1967. So I went to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, in San Antonio for what was called basic training. For the guys, they called it boot camp. For us, it was basic training. And it was 6 weeks of going out into the field, Camp Bullis, riding in helicopters, learning how to carry a gurney, and do things that didn't help at all. It didn't prepare us for Vietnam.
Right.
Nothing prepares you for war but war itself. But so, to answer your question, I'm now leaving basic training, and the outgoing, or the officer who's saying goodbye to us and saying what's next, asked me where I wanted to serve. And I said, well, I volunteered to go to Vietnam. He said, well, we try to send you someplace first to get a little experience.
Right.
Is there a place I said, Fort Lee, Virginia. That sounds like, I've always wanted to see Virginia, Civil War history. So that's where I went. So for 9 months, I was in Fort Lee, Virginia, taking care of returning troops on an orthopedic unit, and got to know what it was like for the guys coming home. And then I got my orders for Vietnam, and I left the end of July. I arrived the last day of July, 1968, and departed the last day of July in 1969, the height of war.
Right. What did you, let's step back just a little bit? You said you learned from the guys that were coming back. What did you observe about them? What were you hearing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dennis. That's intriguing when I stop to think about about that because, they came to us in nice, clean, in the Army, their pajamas were all blue. All right. They were blue in Vietnam and they were blue. So all these guys are in blue pajamas. They all look alike and they're all young and they're all handsome and they're all very traumatized from the war in so many ways. And some of them were not talkative at all. They just kept isolated themselves. Some of them were just always trying to cheer all the rest. Well, first of all, think of the unit that they're in. It's an open bay. They are not in private rooms. It's a ward. And in that ward, it's bed to bed to bed to bed. And there is a screen you can pull around the patient if there's something private that needs to be done. And so all these guys are all together in this unit, and they can all see each other. They can all talk to each other. Some are talkative, some aren't. Some are always cracking up and trying to cheer everybody else up. And others just want to be left alone. Some of them had what we call the 1,000-yard stare, which I learned in the military. I'd never heard that term before, but pretty much you looked at them, you looked into their face, but they looked right through you. They just had that, they say that you can see into the soul through the eyes, and you could just see that trauma and that sadness and fear and pain. These were orthopedic patients. So we had all the, pulleys and all the things that an orthopedic unit has, which is a lot of mechanical devices, if you will, and wheelchairs and crutches and all of the above. But just to give you some funny things, which weren't funny, the first night I was on duty, it was my job as a second lieutenant, now on night duty and in charge of this unit, to hang the IVs, to give the medications, to do all of that. So, excuse me, this patient needed to take his medication, which was pills. So I had to wake him up to get him to swallow these pills. So I went up right to him and I touched his shoulder and I started shaking him. That was the wrong thing to do from a soldier back from Vietnam. And he was startled. He woke up and he was just terrified. And he just about grabbed me. And he said to me, "Don't ever do that again. The next time you do that, I could kill you." And it was like he was ready to just like protect himself. And I was like really startled. So I learned you go to their feet and you wiggle their foot. I said, "Well, next time when I wiggle your foot, it's me, okay? We made a deal. I will wiggle your foot." So I learned that. And then another night, believe it or not, I dropped a bedpan. And the floor was tile, military tradition, so they could scrub and mop. No carpeting. And it was the worst sound on earth. It was a metal bedpan thankfully it was empty, on a tile floor. It woke up every guy in the unit. And they started swearing. And I was, I won't repeat the words. But when I look back on it, it was so darn funny. I'm still laughing about it. I don't know why that was funny. But the next day, the guys all started, they were really upset with me because it woke them up. But they all laughed about it. They all thought it was funny too. Well, they were just getting used to this new second lieutenant. I was 21, and I probably looked like I was about 15. I know I did. I was small. I'm still a small person, and but I was like one of them. Now I was one of them. I was there to take care of them, and they knew it. And but I remember when Ann Cunningham, Army nurse, rotated out of Vietnam, and I got a message from my chief nurse that Ann Cunningham was returning from Vietnam and she would be my roommate in the BOQ, Bachelor Officers Quarters. Now get that, bachelor, right? Okay, I'm in the BOQs, but they were for women, okay? Bachelor Officers Quarters. We were supposed to have a roommate. So, and I was supposed to pick her up at the airport and kind of welcome her to Fort Lee, and she'd just come back from Vietnam. So we were getting to know each other, and I made the comment. She asked me how I liked where I was working. She was an OR nurse, so she was going into the operating room. she asked me how I liked my unit, and I said, well, I love it. I said, it's taking care of these guys is preparing me for Vietnam. And she cut me off short, and she said, Diane, nothing prepares you for Vietnam. I still remember her saying that, and she was right. Taking care of those guys on the orthopedic unit didn't prepare me for Vietnam. It prepared me for taking care of injuries, but I kind of was already prepared for that. I always found that challenging. I love nursing school, and I did my internship in nursing school at the VA hospital. I took care of, this is how old I am, Dennis. When I was at the VA hospital doing my 3-month, a 3-month internship,
Right.
I was taking care of World War I veterans
Wow.
who weren't all that old. When you think, do the math, kind of maybe like our age now, I don't know. But anyway, I was taking care of World War I veterans, World War II, Korea, and then returning Vietnam. I was taking care of 4 different war generations of veterans. Now, we got to request where we wanted to do our internship. Nobody in my entire, there were 45 nurses. I was the only one that requested the VA. It was old. It had a bad reputation. It had rats running around it. It's been completely torn down in a beautiful new hospital. And the other internship I requested was Hennepin County General Hospital. Well, that meant in the emergency room. The Hennepin County General Hospital was also old, but it's where people went who didn't have insurance. And their emergency room was only filled with trauma. Gunshot wounds, stabbings, domestic abuse. I saw it all in the ER in Hennepin County General Hospital. So that prepared me for the blood and the gore and, what you see in an emergency room in those kind of situations. So that part didn't terrify me. So, but that was interesting that Anne said that nothing prepares you for war, because it's true. Only war prepares you for war.
Right. Well, when did you get to Vietnam, and what were your initial impressions when you got there?
I landed in, I think, the Long Bin airport. And we arrived in the dark, and the tarmac wasn't tar. The tarmac was that metal.
Mm-hmm.
What do you call that? There's a name for that metal. And there were big holes in it from being shelled. And we went over those. It was a very bumpy landing. I remember that. I had one Army nurse sitting next to me on the plane, and there were 2 more female nurses. So there were 4 female nurses on that plane total, and there were 200. I think the pilot said something like 267 of us on the plane. And when we landed, the pilot said, "Women out first." Well, that was cool. Why did we get singled out? But so we're in the front waiting to get down the steps. And what met us as they opened the door was a blast of heat and a terrible smell. How do I explain that smell? Maybe like dead fish, for lack of poor sanitation. It did not smell good, and it was humid and hot. And this sweating GI with a bandolier, think Rambo, which I wouldn't watch, by the way. I would not watch those kind of movies, but I saw the previews.
Right.
So the bandolier of ammunition on him and his M16 was ready and alert. And he stood there and said, "Get out, get to the bus." And there were buses lined up, and the buses were black. The buses were dark olive green, I think, but the windows were black. They'd been painted black, and there was like chicken wire in the windows so that if there was any kind of shrapnel or anything going on, it wouldn't get inside the bus. That's what I remember. We got on that bus and we drove to the 90th Replacement Center in Long Bin for us nurses, where they billeted us while they told us where we were going to go. And we went to Supply to get our boots and uniforms and helmet.
Wow. So what are you assigned to, a field station or a hospital or a mass unit? What are you assigned to?
The Army assigns you an MOS, what your specialty is going to be as a nurse. Now, the operating room nurses, if they'd been OR nurses in the United States, they got an OR MOS,
Okay.
meaning military occupational specialty, okay?
Okay.
So then the rest of us, like myself, we were trained, I could work anywhere. But I had requested surgical unit, taking care of preoperative patients and postoperative patients. So I was assigned to a surgical unit in Vung Tau. Well, everybody started saying, Vung Tau, that's on the South China Sea, that's on the beach. You're lucky. That's so cool. I was like, wow, that sounds nice. I'm going to be on the beach. And I'd never heard of Vung Tau. I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about Vietnam except what I'd been seeing on the 6 o'clock news, which was just all horrible. And jungle and rice paddies and wounded soldiers and body bags and helicopters flying around. So they don't have a pair of boots that fits me. So I have a pair of boots that's way too big. And when I opened my duffel bag, there was men's long john underwear in there, and it was leftovers from the Korean War. I kid you not.
Hmm.
And it's like 100 degrees, and we have wool underwear. I shipped it all home to my brothers in Minnesota, and my mom said they loved it and they wore it. And I sent the boots that were too big back to the farm, and my younger brother wore those boots, and he just loved them. So anyway, I get my orders, and there's a helicopter outside waiting for me. And I get on this helicopter, and I'm the only passenger. And there's a door gunner. And the door gunner does not close the door, obviously. He has on a belt, a seat belt, but he's just hanging practically off the end of that door. And so the chopper lifts up, and we take off and head for the sea. It's so beautiful looking down on this beautiful country, and I could see the river, the Mekong River. And I think it's about 75 miles from Saigon or Long Binh, which is close to about 75 miles. I don't know how many minutes it took.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like just minutes, but I thought they sent this helicopter just for me. What a waste of money. Shouldn't there be a bunch of other people with me on this chopper? I was like, oh, I have this chopper all to myself. There was the pilot and the co-pilot who did not talk to me the whole time. And then the door gunner just looked down the whole time, looking for somebody or something horrible to happen.
Right.
So then we got close to the hospital, and I could see that it was, being a farm girl, I certainly knew what a Quonset hut was. A lot of farmers had Quonset huts to store their machinery. So I could see all these Quonset huts with red crosses, and then the helipad had a red cross, and we landed. And then I reported into the chief nurse, and she assigned me to a 66-bed unit that had all preoperative, so all wounded soldiers. They were all trauma. So I'm now a combat trauma nurse. And I walked in, and of course, the first thing I saw was 66 beds that were all full. There were no empty beds, except for the ones who had gone into surgery and waiting to come out back to their beds. But it was about 105 degrees inside that Quonset hut, because it was 100 degrees outside. And there were fans blowing at each end. You know, a Quonset hut,
Yes.
There's a fan at each end, okay, blowing. And I thought, these poor guys, how come can't the Army afford air conditioning for these guys? I was like, what is wrong with this picture?
Right.
Later found out that the only places that were air conditioned were the operating rooms and the recovery rooms and the intensive care unit.
Right. What would a typical day be like for you?
Well, I started a typical day in one flash of a minute. There was hardly any time to be oriented. And I pretty much knew what to do as far as dressing changes. I could do those. I could start IVs, and I could monitor IVs. I could pass out the medication. It was, I think, Dennis, it was just the sheer numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So many, patients in one unit and lack of resources. There were so few of us. The medics were awesome. I had 4 medics.
Right.
We had 4 medics, and they were just incredible. Many of them had already been in the field. And some, after 6 months, if they were lucky, they'd get sent into a hospital. Some of them wanted to stay in the field. So they were awesome. And they did a lot of the heavy duty work, the dressing changes. And some of these patients were ambulatory. So getting them up into wheelchairs, crutches, getting them out to the latrine. The nurses, we were responsible for doctor's orders. They were going into surgery, so they needed certain pain medication. Antibiotics, the whole country was so dirty because of poor sanitation and the soil and just everything about the injuries were, if they were wounded, they had dirt and grime and all kinds of other things in that wound. So they were on heavy doses of antibiotics. Often those were IV, so I was responsible for those. Monitoring the patients, taking their blood pressures, of course, making sure they weren't going into shock, what was their blood pressure, their vital statistics, making sure that you saw the warning signs if there was a complication. So that's what us registered nurses, Army nurses, were responsible for, was the overall well-being of all those patients. And we identified them as VSIs, very seriously ill, SI, seriously ill, and others who had more minor wounds. So the ones with minor wounds, we rehabilitated right there. And as soon as we took their sutures out, once their stitches were out, they went back to the field. Some got the $1 million wound. We stabilized them, and they went stateside or on the Evac chain to Guam, Philippines, Hawaii, the various stops where there were hospitals. Japan, of course, was a big stop for many of them, a halfway stop on their way home. Burns, and so on. So,
were you stationed there the entire time you were in Vietnam? That one location?
no, I'm glad you asked that, because working there for 6 months was working there like for 60 years. The amount of work we did was like, I think I just did a lifetime of nursing in 6 months. And so now my skills are honed. I'm confident. I've worked in the burn unit, Dennis, when the napalm and the white phosphorus victims came in. I was sent over to the burn unit and did debridement. And that was a sad place to work, the burn unit, because so many of them were children and villagers that were hit when the villages were, intentional or not, innocent people died, and lots of them in Vietnam. And there was the Geneva Convention that says if civilians are injured in the crossfires of war, that our military hospitals would care for them. And we did. And we took care of a lot of them. And so oftentimes they were children. So after 6 months, I had heard that we could request a transfer, sort of like the medics. The medics, if they were 6 months in the field, they could actually request to go to Anyway, I went to the chief nurse and said, I'd like to go north. I'd like to go closer to where the fighting is. And this old phrase, be careful what you ask for. Yeah, she said, okay, we need nurses in Pleiku. They're getting hit really hard up there. It was in the mountains. It was in the jungle. It was in the Central Highlands. And it was 13 kilometers from the Cambodian border. And the 4th Infantry Division, it was kind of the epicenter of the fighting about then. 4th Infantry Division was getting hit really hard. So in just a few days, I packed my duffel bag and my helmet and my flak jacket, and I flew up to Quy Nhon, spent the night, and then the next day, another helicopter flew me to Pleiku. And it was interesting because the chopper ride was very different. The scenery was different because now I'm flying over the jungle. And the closer I get to Pleiku and the compound, the hospital with the Red Crosses, was not Quonset huts.
Mhm.
They were buildings. They were wood buildings, individual ones. The whole concept of Army medicine is the cantonment style hospital. That was back in my time, not current.
Right.
But the cantonment style hospital was individual wards. So, like, I don't know how many Quonset huts there were, but a lot of them. Now, these were individual buildings. This building would be the OR. This building would be the ER and OR, of course, were together because they'd go from the ER into the OR.
Right.
There'd be a building for post-op, a building for the medical patients who had tropical diseases and separated from surgery. So those nurses, their MOS was medicine, or a medical unit, internal medicine issues, that kind of thing, tropical diseases, malaria, what have you. So the closer we're getting to Pleiku, I noticed that this agent called Orange had been sprayed, and I didn't know a thing about it. I didn't know there was Agent White, Agent Blue, Agent Orange, but the most barrels that were dumped, as you know, were Agent Orange. But it had been defoliated, and the ground was all red. And all we saw was red dirt. We didn't see any more jungle as we were landing, and we landed in this, like, well, this is depressing. Just the landscape of it. And the air base was not far by, so there were all these big planes were parked at the air base. And then the hospital, unlike Vung Tau, the hospital in Vung Tau was not surrounded by concertina wire. We could come and go. We could walk downtown Vung Tau and have supper. We could go to a restaurant. We could go shopping. We could go to the beach. We could go swimming. And we did. And not to say that Vung Tau was safe either, because no place in Vietnam was safe. And after I left, the hospital did get rocketed, but never while I was there. But now I'm in Pleiku, and it's a hospital is surrounded by concertina wire. Think fencing, like cattle fencing with barbed wire.
Mhm.
Concertina wire is rolled. People say, well, what is concertina wire? It sounds like a piano. No, well, is that concertina wire in a piano? I don't know. But this is wire that's rolled in a big ball. And so that if a sapper, if the enemy tries to get in, they can't get through the concertina wire because they'll get all trapped in it.
Right.
And that did happen at Pleiku, where one of our guards actually shot a Vietnamese, probably a Viet Cong, who was trying to get into the hospital with his weapon. And there were 4 guard towers around. So I'm trying to give you a picture now of the 71st Evacuation Hospital in Pleiku. Brown wooden buildings, lots of them, surrounded by concertina wire, surrounded by 4 guard towers, always 24/7. It was the medics who had to pull guard. So when they weren't working in the hospital, they were up in the tower, and they got shot at too.
Right.
We lost a couple of them. And then a gate to come and go. And to get out of the gate, you were supposed to have orders. And why are you leaving? And so that was the 71st Evac, and very close to the Cambodian border. And the war flipped for me. It was completely different. It was cooler, which was nice because the temperature in the mountains. I actually asked my mom to send me an electric blanket. I actually had an electric blanket. Anyway, the war was very different there. I was immediately, because I had all that experience of 6 months, I was made head nurse in this surgical unit with very seriously ill patients in it who were on ventilators. And we were short of nurses. And it's a 44 bed unit of seriously wounded soldiers. And now we have Artillery Hill. And so I wasn't used to hearing all this terrible incoming and outgoing noises. And so I got used to the sounds, because there was always outgoing artillery, and you knew what that was. It was just a different sound. But when there was incoming, the first thing we would hear are the red alert sirens. So the siren would go off, and as soon as you heard that siren, the SOP, standard of procedure, military term, was to grab your helmet and your flak jacket and run for the hospital because you knew that more patients would be coming in, or if it was imminent, just get under your bed. The beds were raised higher so that going under the bed was our bunker. That was going to save our life, right?
Right.
Well, it might not save our life, but it at least made us feel better being underneath there, having some protection, right? And we were rocketed and mortared when the incoming came in. Sometimes it was just nothing happened. The outgoing artillery took care of the enemy that was firing at us. But there were times that they got through and the hospital was rocketed, our hooches were rocketed and mortared, and it was pretty frightening.
Yeah.
It was a lot more intense. My patients were more, they were right out of the field, by the way. They did not come to us in blue pajamas from other hospitals like at Vung Tau. They came to us right out of the field. So, and it was our job. This was, to answer your earlier question, Dennis, it's in the field. It's a field hospital, but it's called an evacuation hospital. The hospital in Vung Tau was the 36th evacuation hospital. It was 400 beds. And this 71st evacuation hospital in Pleiku, I believe, was also 400 beds. And it was always full, by the way. Mm-hmm. But our job as an evacuation hospital was they came into the ER, they were triaged. How serious is this? Do they go to surgery immediately, or do they wait? The whole concept of triage is to not commit all your resources to one patient. For example, I'll give you an example. So say there's battlefield amputations, and they would come into our hospital, and they survived because those medics did those cut downs and got the albumin started and tourniquets, and the medics did their job to get them to us, to get them to the dust-off helicopter. Those medevac pilots were so courageous and so brave, going into unbelievably dangerous zones that were extremely dangerous, not just because of enemy fire and small arms fire and everything else, but weather, wind, rain, monsoons, and trying to get the wounded out. So the wounded would come to us, and then in the ER, the triage would begin. And if someone came in, let's say, with battlefield amputation of all 4 limbs, and there were a lot of other patients in that load with maybe 2 limbs missing, the young man with 2 limbs missing would go in first. And why? Because those surgeons could take care of him, get him out of the OR, and bring in the next casualty. So that the more casualties you could save, not that you didn't want to save that young man with all 4, but if he was going to take 20 hours in the OR or 10, what have you, they would take the patient that would take 5 hours in the OR. That would be, I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say here, if I'm making any sense. So then from the ER, they would go to the OR, or they would go to ICU immediately, or to my unit, which was wait, get them ready, stabilize them, prepare them to get back into the OR, or get them on an airplane and get them out of there. If they weren't hemorrhaging, take them, the air evac chain and those Air Force nurses, get them out of our hospital and evacuate them someplace else. And then once they were out of my unit, I don't know where they went, to another in-country hospital. When I was in Vietnam, I was told there were 26 hospitals in Vietnam. And I'll tell you what other kinds they were as well. But so they might go to another hospital in country and be rehabilitated. And then when their delayed primary closure is taken care of and the sutures are out, they go back to their unit. Or again, they might take them directly to the United States if it was a burn, to the burn unit in Brooke Army Medical Center. I didn't explain DPCs. All of our patients had DPCs. Delayed primary closure is because of what I mentioned before about bacteria.
Yep.
And dirty wounds. You can't close a dirty wound. If you do, it's just going to be infected and it's going to cause complications, and the patients may get gangrene, they may die. So the delayed primary closure is what caused a lot of work for especially our medics. For 3 days, those wounds, no matter how big they were irrigated with sterile normal saline, irrigated, painful, and then dressed with or packed with a type of dressing. And then we'd give the morphine, and the medics would pull that dressing out. Think of the pain, and re-irrigate it and clean it up, and then tons of antibiotics, and then they would go back to surgery. That was my unit. That's what we did. But some of my patients were also on ventilators because they had sucking chest wounds. They had chest wounds, and they had chest bottles and all kinds of tubes everywhere, chest tubes, IV tubes, blood lines. That was my unit. And tracheotomies. Okay. So those were labor intensive. Those required a lot of skilled nursing, observation, and care. And that was our team. I usually had one other, believe it or not, on this 44-bed unit, I had one other nurse with me. And when I'm saying nurse right now, we think of women as nurses, but about 20% or more, was it 24%, of the nurses in Vietnam were male. We had male nurses in Vietnam. And many of them were in the orthopedic units because of the heavy lifting, moving patients around with orthopedic injuries. But in my unit, I had female nurses and then 4 medics. So we worked from dusk to dawn. We worked, every day. We were lucky if we got a day off. So it was supposed to be 6 days a week. Our shifts were supposed to be 12 hours, but they were usually 14, 15, 16. We stayed till the work was done. And then we just walked back to our hooch. Was not, I don't know, not very far away. It was all part of the hospital compound. So we worked, we ate, we slept, we worked, we ate, we slept, and we could go nowhere at Pleiku because it was supposedly off limits. But us nurses, we like to break the rules. We were young. I was 21. I was 20. I had my 22nd birthday in Vietnam. We like to break the rules. So, and we did. And it was probably stupid. We probably should have obeyed the rules. We could have gotten into trouble. So a few of us nurses decided one day we wanted to see downtown Pleiku. So we just snuck out of the gate and found some cute young GI and said, "Would you take us downtown Pleiku? Well, are you on orders?" And we said, "No, but we don't care, and you won't get into trouble because we don't know your name." So he took us downtown Pleiku and dropped us off. Not smart to do. It was nothing like Vung Tau because it was very primitive. There were no restaurants. There was no shopping. This was the village of Pleiku. And so we got bored pretty quickly and started to leave. And then the military police were on us and said, "Well, lieutenants, have you had your fun now?" And we said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, we're taking you back." They got us in jeeps and got us back safely. But, our thinking was, what are they going to do? Send us to Vietnam if we got into trouble? We were threatened with Article 15s. The funny part about that was none of us even knew what an Article 15 was. If you break the orders, if you don't have orders or you break the orders or you go up flying when you're not supposed to, you will get an Article 15. And we just all laughed because we thought, well, we don't even know what that is. So, and what could they do? Send us back to Vietnam? And plus, we were so needed that
Right.
they would get rid of us. So it's, everybody breaks the rules in a war zone, right?
Yeah. So when you said you work 6 days a week, what did you do on the 7th day? Did you just kind of hang around and relax, or what kind of recreation, I guess, did you guys have?
There, believe it or not, this was so shocking. Pleiku had a swimming pool, and I would go sit around it, but I didn't want to get in it because it did not look very clean. And I didn't want to get sick, and I didn't want to get, the guys were getting hepatitis from drinking rice wine. Rice wine, obviously, is wine made from rice, but it's made from dirty water. And rule number one is don't drink the water. So I never drank the water, and I didn't think the water in the swimming pool didn't look very clean. So I would go sit out there with a book and read to relax. And that was kind of nice. But there was the guys would play volleyball. I don't know why us women didn't. The guys would throw footballs back and forth. But I pretty much just stayed in my room and read books or slept because I was exhausted, or listened to music. What saved me in Vietnam was music. Music was really precious. And I loved the 60s music. And it was 60s music was all about war. It was very socially conscious. There was a lot of social commentary,
Right.
Anti-war music. I loved it all. I thought it was great. I thought, I'm glad people are against the war. What I didn't know when I got home was that, they just weren't against the war. They were against us veterans for having served in that war too.
Right.
But mainly just doing some of my own laundry, because the mama sons were supposed to do our laundry, but they stole it. And then we were left without things we needed. So I would do some of my own laundry. They didn't steal our uniforms. So I would put my uniform out, and my boots, and they would shine my boots and wash my uniforms, because they had no need for those uniforms, because they certainly couldn't put one on
Right.
and wear it, right? So the uniforms would come back and my boots, but everything else I would take care of myself.
Were you able to keep in touch with family back home?
Well, when I think about the Iraq and Afghanistan vets and how they had their iPads and their cell phones and could communicate with family. We were told when we got to Vietnam, Dennis, believe it or not, that we could have one phone call home during the year. One.
Wow.
I was like, one, okay, we get one phone call home a year. Well, whoever came up with that idea? So I had my one, and of course I waited till Christmas, so did everybody else. And I was in Vung Tau at the time. And so I commandeered a Jeep because I had to go up a hill. And I remember it was up a hill because that's where the satellite, up on the hill, they had better connection, I suppose. So it was a ham radio operator. And I went in and I picked the time when I knew Dad would be up from the barn and Mom had her night off, evenings. She worked evenings. So I picked like 9 o'clock at night because Dad would be done with his chores. They'd both be home. And my dad picked up the phone. And I had to say over and I had to say out. And my dad didn't know how to deal with that. But I think he just broke down because it was total shock. They didn't know I was going to call. So that was my one phone call home. It was during Christmas. That was it. Otherwise, it was lots of letters back and forth.
Right. Tell us about your homecoming.
Well, I'm talking about it now, but I couldn't talk about it for years because it was so painful. We were warned. Now it's 1969. It's the height of the war. The majority of names on the wall in Washington, D.C. are from 1968 and 69. So for me, the war was never ending. It was a conveyor belt of casualties. And so where my adrenaline is at. And it's so surreal. It's like I had just come from living in I used to call it, I lived in a hallucination. I don't think I was ever there. I just hallucinated this. It was so surreal. I actually questioned, and I've talked to other nurses who thought this too, were we even really there? And then we tried to just stuff it all. Because when we came home, if we talked about it, we set ourselves up for humiliation or very unkind, disparaging remarks. And it wasn't just toward the men, it was towards the women. It was us too. People have been surprised when I tell them that well, they wouldn't treat nurses like that, would they? And I said, oh, yeah, they did. It was all of us. The anti-war sentiment was strong, and I was glad for the anti-war protesters. But I wasn't glad about the ones that were anti-veteran as well, anti-soldier as well. That just couldn't be happening, but it was happening. It was painful. It was hard. It made you angry, but you couldn't show your anger. A lot of the guys came home and died in high-speed motorcycle accidents and high-speed car accidents and self-medicating alcohol. Vietnam was like a vending machine for drugs. A lot of soldiers were, smoking marijuana. Alcohol was practically free. It was so cheap in the officers' clubs. And I wasn't judgmental. I thought, well, each to their own. However they can get through the war, that's their thing. But I didn't do drugs and alcohol because I was basically afraid of it. I had a job to do, and I hadn't been doing it, as a young girl or in nursing school. So I'm glad I didn't have that problem to overcome like so many veterans did, because it was self-medicating.
Right.
And that contributed even to another layer of post-traumatic stress disorder and rehabilitation and all of that. But my way of dealing with it was not dealing with it, just not talking about it. I told my parents they wanted to give me a party when I came home, and I said, no, please, no party. If you give a party, Mom, I won't be there. Well, Diane, all the neighbors want to come and welcome you home. I said, no, Mom, I wrote in a letter, no party. I won't come if there's a party. So she didn't. So that was kind of dancing on eggshells that my family did for several years, just not talking about it. And when I married Mike, I told him not to tell anybody I was in Vietnam because I didn't want to talk about it. It just set me up for there was never a good outcome when the subject of Vietnam came up.
Right.
So I got a job. It's now August 1969. I'm back from Vietnam. So I'd saved all my money and I wanted to buy my first car. So I'm back on the farm now, and I need to get a job. I'm out of the Army. I need to get a job, so I need a car. I need to get to work. So I asked Dad to go to the car dealership with me. So there's only one, I don't know, I think there was only one car dealership in Buffalo. But there was this 1969 Mercury Cougar with a black vinyl top and olive green car. Mm-hmm. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And I walked up to it and I said, Dad, that's the one I want. And my dad is shaking his head. And Diane, the used car lot is over here. You don't need a new car. I said, this is my first car, Dad. I've saved up the money. Okay. The salesman gives me a key and Dad and I go test drive it, and we're driving and we get back. And my dad is a mechanic because he can fix anything on the farm. He fixes all his equipment. And Dad would only go to town to buy parts. He'd bring the part home and fix the tractor. And so he opens up the hood, props it open. He looks at the engine and he said, this is a V8. That's too much engine for you. And I said, what's a V8? Now he's really shaking his head, and so is the car dealer. He's just standing there like hoping I'm going to buy this car, but my dad is going to talk me out of it. So I said, well, how much is the car? Well, it's $2,900. And Dad said, well, how much is that going to cost you in interest per month? I said, Dad, I have the money in cash. I'm just going to go pay cash for this car. And my dad is like, you can't believe this. Well, I saved every penny. So I bought the 1969 Cougar, and now I'm going to drive from the farm an hour into the Twin Cities to my first job at a big, beautiful new hospital. And this new hospital was a trauma center, so of course I picked it. But at this trauma center, they didn't put me in the ER or the ICU. They put me on a unit that was post-op for gallbladder surgery, appendectomies, vein strippings. It was very boring. And I was not happy in my job. So after 3 weeks, I quit. After 3 weeks of civilian nursing. I was like a fish out of water. I didn't relate to the other nurses. I was always getting in trouble because I did things I was not supposed to do, which I did in Vietnam. I put down in an NG tube and I started IVs, and the nursing supervisor, Miss Carlson, you cannot do these things. These are things are done by the externs when they come in. And I said, well, these are the things I used to do. And she said, well, you don't do them here. And I just shook my head. So I quit. So then I went to Madigan Army Hospital with my hoochmate from Vietnam. She still had a few months left in the Army and got orders for Madigan Army Hospital, Fort Lewis in Washington State. And she had just bought a Plymouth Barracuda. So now
Wow.
we've got the Barracuda and the Cougar following each other, going to Washington State. And I'm going to work as a civilian nurse in a military hospital. And I loved it. I was right back doing military nursing. But then I said, why am I doing this? If I'm going to be working in a military hospital, I'm going back in the Army. So I re-upped. I rejoined the Army Nurse Corps after a short break.
Mm-hmm.
I got orders for Brooke Army Medical Center at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. This is now 1970, and I'm driving my Cougar from Minnesota to Brooke Army Medical Center. And I walked up the stair. I parked the car, walked up the stairs in this beautiful old historic. Now it's a historic building. They have a new hospital. And as I'm walking up the steps, I meet Colonel Gann. And Colonel Gann was the chief nurse at Pleiku. And I just happened to like run into her, and Colonel Gann said, well, Captain Carlson, it's good to see you back in the Army. And I said, well, I'm not a captain. I'm a lieutenant, Colonel Gann. Don't you remember? She said, no, I just promoted you. So now I'm a captain in the Army Nurse Corps. And then we're still on the steps just chatting. And she said, where do you want to work? And I said, you mean I have a choice? And she said, well, I can't promise you. And I said, well, I want to work in ICU, surgical. She said, good, because that's where I have you assigned. Just go up to 13A and sign in. So I was back in the Army in 1970, and basically that saved my life because I was back doing what I could do. And the skills from what I learned in Vietnam were all accepted and transferred really to this busy recovery room, intensive care unit, and recovery ward where I was head nurse. And because I became head nurse shortly after my assignment there, it was a major slot, but I was up for it. And I really loved my work there and didn't get out till November of 1972 then when I met my husband, who was a surgery resident in that unit. And we married in 1971. And then in 72, when we started a family, I wanted to stay home and take care of the family, not turn the baby over to a daycare center.
Right.
So
You said earlier that you weren't able to talk about it for a long time. What changed? What allowed you to be able to talk about your experiences?
well, from 1969 until 1982, I didn't talk about it, except sometimes it would come out sideways and it would come out of anger in defending. I found I was always defending Vietnam veterans.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always defending the men because I had just seen how they suffered, how they died, and I had seen how brave they were. And I felt they were just as brave and just as good as any World War II vet, any Korean, any vet, war vet prior to them. And I had seen their courage and I had seen their suffering. And how dare did these anti-war protesters say those things about them? Things like, well, they're nothing but a bunch of glassy-eyed, drug-addicted baby killers.
Right.
They call them baby killers and other deplorable things. And sometimes my anger would come out sideways. And after my husband and I after he was in private practice after leaving the military, there was a Christmas party for the surgeons and the doctors in the OR, and the spouses were invited, and some doctor was loud and obnoxious, and the subject of Vietnam had come up, and he said, all those Vietnam, because now Vietnam vets were coming out with PTSD, and they were lobbying Congress, we're dying by the thousands of suicide. We need help. They were lobbying the VA for help with all these suicides. And the emotional wounds of war were coming out sideways, and divorces and difficulty with maintaining relationships, difficulty with getting a job, maintaining a job, all the things that were the result of that war, not just because of what happened in Vietnam, but because what was happening here at home. We were disenfranchised, many vets, from even veterans would not check the box on the application that said if they're a veteran. If they said that, they wouldn't get hired. So it was just so much turbulence, and so this doctor was loud and obnoxious, and he said all those Vietnam vets who are, he used the F word, were F-upped, before they ever went to Vietnam. And I just got so angry. I stood up and pointed at him, and I said, the only person in this room who is F-upped is you. And I never use that word. My husband is sitting there like, what did she just say? I've never heard her say that word before. But I was angry, and I was sticking up in the best way I could because I'd lost my voice. Then I started to sweat, and I started to shake. And I did this to my husband, and I said, we're leaving. And boy, did we leave in a hurry. We got up, got in the car, and we left. And I said to him, and that's why I told you, don't ever tell anybody I was a nurse in Vietnam. I don't want anybody to know. Because something always was humiliating. It always went wrong. And somebody had said to me once when the subject came up, looked at me and said, well, why'd you go there in the first place? And another person had said to me, well, you're no better than those baby killers. You're just over there oiling the war machine. And this was a man who said this to me, who was probably a draft dodger and all of the above. But he looked at me and he said, you're no better than those baby killers. You're just over there oiling the war machine. And I had to wrap my head around. And of course, he turned his back and walked off. And I thought, what did he just say? What does that even mean? So I'm oiling the war machine. That means as a nurse, I'm saving lives so they can go back and kill more babies.
Right.
It was like, where does this come from? So, of course, why did I just not talk about it? Because I'd lost my voice. I didn't know how to respond except out of anger and use a swear word. I couldn't think about what to say, and I was so afraid of being hurt again and again and again, and filled with shame, like I had done something shameful by serving my country, and like these men had done something shameful by wearing the uniform and serving their country. We didn't ask. I mean, yeah, I volunteered to go over there, but we didn't start the fire. And there was an altercation at the Minneapolis airport. That was awful when I came into Minneapolis, and how I was treated because I was in uniform. That was my first unwelcome home. My duffel bag was coming down the chute in the baggage claim, and I was in my uniform, and so were a bunch of other guys. And they were from Minnesota too. We were all getting off the plane together, and they could see that I was a nurse. They could see my caduceus, and I was a lieutenant. And this young enlisted man said, as my bag was coming down the chute, those duffel bags were heavy. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'll get that for you, ma'am. And he grabs my duffel bag. And these hecklers over here says to him, let her carry her own damn bags. She's in a man's army. Wrong thing to say. The enlisted man went over there and hit him in the face. His nose was bleeding. He put him on the floor and he was pounding his face. And his buddy was pulling him off, and he said, we got to get the hell out of here. And they ran off. And the guy's on the floor, and I go over to him and I say, don't take it out on us. We didn't start that war. Thank goodness Mom and Dad were late. They're always late. Dad is always late. A tractor, stalled, or it was going to rain and he had to get the hay in, or there was a cow that he couldn't find. Dad was always late. And I was always so grateful. And to this day, they don't know about that they didn't see that. Because if my dad had seen what had happened, it would have been devastating to him that's how I was treated when I came back.
Right.
Serving. Yeah. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah. How do you think, when you look back on it, your experience there, how did it shape who you became as a person?
Well, it all started in Pleiku when LBJ was lying to us.
Oh.
And we don't live under a rock. We still get the news. We still get the news from the States. We know what's happening. We've seen pictures, excuse me, of the war protests, the parades, the flags being burned. There was a college building in Madison, Wisconsin that was blown up. The National Mall, there were protests. There were protests that seemed everywhere. We knew that. We didn't know how it was going to feel to come home and that the protests were also against us personally. But when we were told that, when LBJ and then Nixon were talking about Cambodia and that we were not in Cambodia, well, we knew that was a lie. I was near the Cambodian border, and the 4th Infantry Division was hit so hard, and those casualties coming in were coming from Cambodia.
Right.
So I guess this is my first indication of my personality. And because the commander, or the vice, it wasn't the top commander, but probably the vice one, a senior officer came into my unit, and I was the head nurse. And that senior officer said to me, "Lieutenant, we are supposedly not in Cambodia. So we've been told to put nothing in the patient's chart that he was injured in Cambodia." I didn't say a thing because he's a senior officer. He leaves, and I thought to myself, it's one thing to be lied to, but he just asked me to be a liar with him.
Yeah.
So every single patient that I took care of, I said, "Where were you wounded?" And they said, "Cambodia, ma'am." I went back and put on the chart in big letters, "Wounded in Cambodia." I wonder how many of those charts have Diane, Lieutenant Carlson, wounded in Cambodia. Nobody said anything to me when I never got called on it. But I thought, I'll be damned if I'm going to lie for them.
Right.
Because the lies that were coming out of, we knew they were lying about the number of casualties of the Viet Cong and the NVA, because they were using body count as to whether we were winning or losing the war. So, 11 US soldiers lost in firefight, but 450 Viet Cong and NVA killed in firefight. And it was like, that's not true, because we'd hear, we got reports coming back. So, and then there's so many lies. You can read books about that. I'm not going to go into them. Lies by our government to keep that war going when they could have stopped it. So there was a big lie. And then now I come home and I see how the soldiers are treated, and I don't see the government standing up for us. No president, no Department of Defense secretary, nobody in the cabinet stood up for Vietnam vets, and they betrayed us. The government betrayed us. And so I felt this betrayal on so many levels. And I couldn't let go of that. And I was silent until 1982, when I went out to Washington, D.C. for the dedication of the wall. And I knew I had to be there because I knew there were names I had to find, one of them being Sharon Lanes. Sharon was killed in Vietnam when I was there. It was in June of 1969. And it's sort of like everybody remembers where they were when JFK died.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I remember what I was doing and where I was when a medic tapped me on the shoulder and took me aside. I was hanging an IV on a casualty, and he took me aside and he said, "Lieutenant, an Army nurse was just killed at Chu Lai when the hospital was attacked." And I didn't know her name at the time, but I learned that later. And she was from Canton, Ohio. And so her name I had to find, and then a patient that I had taken care of that was from Minnesota. And we had built up this bond because we were both Minnesotans. And so I knew I had to go out for the dedication, and that's my turning point, because the memorial that Maya Lin designed was so perfect. It was so beautiful. To have the names, I mean, not one person was left out or forgotten, except, of course, the MIAs and the POWs, and names that they found later and added. But the purpose was not one veteran would be for, not one lost soldier, airman, Marine, Navy, any military personnel in the armed forces would be forgotten. Their names would be in perpetuity on the wall. And I just thought it was so perfect the way it was underground, because when you entered that site, it just felt like it was embracing you almost, and like being in a church or something, and people would be quiet, and there wasn't laughter, and of course most of us were crying by that time, and hugging one another. And there was a moment that I'll never forget, and the only thing I put on was my boonie cap. Now, when you look at pictures, Dennis, were you there in '82 for the dedication?
I was not, no.
So, so many of the soldiers, for the first time, put on their uniforms, the jungle fatigues, the jungle boots, their boonie caps. If they hadn't thrown them away after the war was over, like their medals, so many threw away their medals because the medals just didn't mean anything to the country, even though this person had gotten a Bronze Star for Valor or a Silver Star, or, the country didn't care. They didn't treat us like even the true heroes. We're not all heroes. I don't believe in that. No, we're not all heroes. Save that term for the true heroes who went above and beyond and all of the above, and leave that medal reserved for those who truly did deserve it. And that's arguable because, of course, the wounded soldiers say us nurses we were their heroes, and in our way we were, because we were there for them and we helped save their lives. But so for the first time since the war, veterans are putting on something that identifies them. They wouldn't have done that previously, because if somebody saw them in uniform, they would get beat up or something thrown at them, either something physical like an egg thrown at them, or words that were harmful thrown at them. So I wore my boonie cap. I did put that on. And so I'm going to touch a name. And before I can do that, this soldier who was crippled, he had a cane, and he touched me and he said, "Ma'am, were you a nurse in Vietnam?" And I said, "I was." And I felt like, well, at least he's not going to throw something at me or say something terrible. And he just said, "I've always wanted to thank my nurse that saved my life." And then he hugged me and said, "Thank you," as if I was his nurse. And that was the very first thank you that I had heard. I came home in '69 and I'd never heard one thank you, not from anybody. It's not something your mother says to you, "Thank you for your service, Diane,"
Right.
or your dad. I mean, they hug you and love you and care about you. But I thought, I've never heard those two words in my life. Thank you. And like I was his nurse in that moment. And then he started to sob. And I just felt like, well, if he belongs here, I belong here. This memorial is for us. And then I found Sharon's name and Eddie Lee Evanson's name. And then I did something I'd never done before. I couldn't cry before. I had no tears. I was too locked, everything was too locked, too tight. I had no tears. And I cried for the first time. And that unleashed some grief I'd never had a funeral. I'd never had a wake. I had never grieved over those who died in Vietnam. I had never grieved. I couldn't grieve because I couldn't. There weren't any feelings there. They were trapped somewhere in my brain. And I had no feelings. I just felt, I didn't feel joy. I loved my kids. My children brought me joy. And my wonderful husband, who was always caring and kind and good and compassionate for me. So, of course, I loved them. But yeah, I just didn't feel the joy in life that I probably would have if I'd never been to Vietnam. But that's what started that was the genesis of my coming out. But then the genesis of my activism was when I learned that not everybody thought Maya Lin's wall was perfect. There was a powerful force of men, veterans out there, who didn't like the wall. They didn't like that it was black. They didn't like that it was underground. They didn't like that it was designed by an Asian woman, and they used pejorative words that weren't nice words about her. And so the Secretary of the Interior at the time, who had given the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, those who built the wall, permission to build it on the National Mall in the nation's capital, wouldn't give them a building permit till they decided to satisfy this other faction of veterans who wanted something more heroic. Heroic meaning men in bronze. So Frederick Hart was commissioned and designed a statue of 3 men. And I saw pictures of it in newspapers and on the news, and I was kind of incredulous. I thought the wall was perfect the way it was, but these men wanted something that portrayed men heroically. So they did. And that's when I thought, now things aren't complete. If there's going to be a statue to men, the visitors, will look at the men and not think about the women, or not even know women were there in Vietnam and elsewhere. So that was the genesis of my start in this whole thinking that if there's a statue to men, the memorial is now. Maya Lin's design was finished. It was complete. Now it's incomplete. They just added something to that. It's incomplete. There needs to be one to women. So in 1983, I was out there again. I went out every year on Veterans Day and Memorial Day after that. And I came home and told my husband, well, if they're going to have a statue to men, there has to be one to women. And Mike said, well, who's going to do that? I said, well, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to do something about it. So I just started making phone calls, and yeah, one thing led to another.
Wow. Let me ask you one more question. What would you like people to know about your service, about your fellow soldiers?
Well, I can put it in a nutshell, Dennis. Why did I fight for 10 years? So in 1983, the genesis, the dream, there was something burning inside of me. There needs to be a statue to women. I could see it. Mm-hmm. I could visualize it. You know, they say, what is a vision? What is a vision? Well, what is a dream? You know, whatever. But I had a very clear vision. I could see a statue to women. I didn't know we'd end up with 3 women in a statue and a wounded soldier, which we have, dedicated in 1993 because Glenna Goodacre captured my vision. I had the dream, but she made the dream come true, mm-hmm. is how I like to say it. I didn't create the statue, the design. I told her what she needed to do, you know, in our criteria was the visitor must know in an instant that these are the women who served in Vietnam. We don't want something abstract. We don't want a park bench. We don't want flower beds. We don't want a bas relief. We want a statue that looks like women, like the statue of the 3 men. They look like men, don't they? And so she captured that so beautifully in her artistic way. where was I going with that thought? What was your question then, Dennis?
It was what would you like people to know about your service?
Okay, so that's right. So what I want people to know about why this was so important and why I fought for this. Why did I spend 10 years fighting for this and not giving up? Because we were kicked to the curb when this idea came up, and we were ridiculed. And like, what did women do in Vietnam anyway? There were so few of us. Why? And we don't deserve a memorial on the mall. I mean, the things that were said when I finally got organized. And getting organized to raise money means you have to find people to help you do this. And so I was on the phone a lot, and American Legion, VFW, Vietnam Veterans of America, Disabled American Veterans, Military Order Purple Hearts. I went to all of them to get their support. This took a long time, and we had to raise money. So now we have to be a nonprofit. We have to have a board of directors. We have to have bylaws. We have to have a chair or a president, and invite people to serve on the board. We have to register in Minnesota, where I started this, with the Minnesota Charities Review Board, or whatever it's called. And then we had to get an IRS number, and then we had to report our fundraising and stay within the parameters of, we had to do everything legally,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh my gosh, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a public speaker. I'm a nurse. What do I know? I know nothing except what I knew was that women deserved this memorial, and they needed it for their healing. They needed it to feel recognized and valued for their contribution. Their families needed it so their families could learn more about their loved one who served anywhere around the world, because we embraced all women who had served during the Vietnam era, not just in Vietnam, to be included in this memorial. And that took a lot of time and a lot of hard work. But one thing I knew, as much as I wanted to at times, I knew I couldn't quit. I was not going to give up. I told you that earlier, growing up on the farm. We had animals. We were like old McDonald's farm. We had pigs, we had cows, we had chickens, we had dogs, we had cats, we had geese.
Right.
We had all those animals. And you had to feed them or they would die. You had to feed them, or the cows had to be milked, and that was our bread and butter. The milk and the cream that went to the creamery. The crops sustained the animals. The animals sustained us. We had our chores to do. We had to work hard, and we couldn't quit. Okay, because they depended on us.
Right.
And then in nursing, it's the same thing. You don't give up on. We never gave up on a patient in Vietnam, ever. We didn't give up. We were with them till the end, holding their hand as they passed away, or doing whatever it took to get them to the next place for hospitalization. That was our job. So what I learned on the farm and what I learned in Vietnam is what kept me going in those 10 years. Like, I'm not giving up. And how dare they say these ridiculous things about us? For example, when we were being ridiculed, it came from the...
You muted yourself. You muted yourself.
Oh, I just hit the mute button.
There you go.
So people have always asked me, well, where did the opposition come from? I said it came from everywhere. But at first, we were just sort of ignored. Mahatma Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. That's exactly what the first day they just ignored us. But now, when we're getting more press that we're digging in and we're doing all the things we need to do, we're going to federal agencies in Washington, D.C., we're testifying, and the American Legion, VFW, we're gaining momentum, we're gaining support. Then they laughed at us. We were told, I was told by people in powerful places in DC that it would never happen anyway. Oh, you're wasting your time, Diane. It is never going to happen. You're wasting your time. They just laughed us off.
Yeah.
Then we fast forward, we're gaining momentum, and now we're getting support from some big organizations. Then they fight us. And then editorials in newspapers all across the country were popping up, and they were all against us. One of them I think it was in Missouri, maybe it was Kansas. Anyway, the articles are all in the Library of Congress because I saved clippings, I saved everything. All the proof of what happened in those 10 years is now stored in the Library of Congress. People can go there and see that, that I'm telling the truth. This is what happened. Said that I was a radical feminist using the Vietnam dead to further my cause. And the worst one, the most laughable one, but it wasn't laughable at the time when it came out in an Indianapolis newspaper, said that adding a statue of a woman at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial would be like adding Elvis Presley to Mount Rushmore. Like unnecessary, inappropriate, wrong, stupid. And same article said, well, to make the women happy, maybe we should paint the Statue of Liberty Dayglow pink. Or paint a picture of a woman now in the canoe with George Washington crossing the Delaware River. I thought, where do these people come with this? What did they just say? They're talking about nurses in Vietnam and they're comparing us like pink, like women want pink. I mean, it was so ludicrous. And what happened, the bottom line for me personally, Dennis, was the madder they made me, and they did make me mad, angry, the harder I worked, because it was like, I'm going to show them.
Right.
They didn't have any reasonable, I'm a reasonable, I think, and logical person. I think logically. Some people might say I don't, but I thought what they just said was illogical and unreasonable and actually pretty stupid. So they don't have any good reasons why women don't deserve a statue on the mall. Although the Commission of Fine Arts used some artistic language and said adding a statue of a woman at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial would upset the delicate balance of tension that exists there now. And I thought, well, the statue of the three men didn't upset the delicate balance of tension. How can the women change it?
Right.
So, and then it took Congress because we were defeated at all the agencies in DC, the powerful agencies that are the gatekeepers to the National Mall. And they need to have gatekeepers to the National Mall. We can't just put anything on the National Mall. There needs to be criteria.
Right.
There needs to be a law. There needs to, all of that. And we were following all of that. But we didn't see any criteria that said that women couldn't be on the mall. So, but we had to go to Congress. So 2 years later, after two bills in Congress and getting all of Senate and House on our side, on the second year and the last day of the when the Senate was so it was November, it passed. And now we have the site at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. We got the site because we were told we couldn't have the site. No way could women be whatever.
Yeah.
So now we have the site. Now we have to get the design. So the next phase of this is after 8 years of doing this now, 8.5 years, we have to have a design competition to find a new design. And that's when we found Glenna Goodacre. And then she had a year to build it, which she did. And then we planned it for Veterans Day 1993.
Wow.
And that's not the end of the story, because then after the dedication, we continued our mission. So I was chair of the board for like 30 years. So it's been 40 years that I've been doing this. But we continued our mission in education, sister search, finding the women who served, and facilitating research, and also facilitating stories about the women who served to be unearthed, if you will, to encourage the women to share their stories about their service in Vietnam or wherever they served during the Vietnam era, and get those stories like what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Get them recorded visually or in writing. And so we worked with all kinds of people like yourself, Dennis, to identify the women, how to reach them, get their permission so that you and others could interview them and in perpetuity record these stories forever and ever and ever, so that people will know who we were and what we did during the Vietnam era. 265,000 women served around the world during the Vietnam era. About 10,000 of us women served in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. That includes civilian women. We embrace them. We include them in our efforts, our educational efforts. The civilian women could not be included in the statue itself in uniform because the legislation says the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, signed in 1989 by Jimmy Carter, is dedicated to the men and women. It said women. So I thought we already had our legislation, but no, we have to go back for 2 years and get new legislation when the original legislation said women, but the 8 women who died, their names are on the wall, so they're included. But it says dedicated to the men and women who served in the armed forces. Okay, so for example, we couldn't have a Red Cross woman on the uniform on our, but we embraced the Red Cross women and all the women who are civilians in our ceremonies, in our story, encouraging of stories, in our educational component, and finding them and welcoming them to be with us for all kind of commemorations and activities at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And they have been so grateful for that, that we consider them one of us, that they serve too in support of the armed forces. So they are definitely included in our effort. So.
Well, that's great. Well, Diane, I want to thank you very much on behalf of the Americans of Wartime Museum for sharing your story. It's an incredible story, both during the war and after. So thank you very much for doing that. You know how important it is to get these stories. So thank you.
I do. And we're not getting any younger. So I'm glad you're doing them now, Dennis.
Right. And I also want to say thank you for your service. I know it sounds cliche, but it is heartfelt. And I also want to welcome you home. Thank
you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you, Dennis, for what you do to unearth the stories and preserve them into perpetuity. Yeah. It's important. Yeah. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.